You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than why are people so unkind?
Why are people so unkind?
That question would have to be, Mark, is the Soviet Jupiter 12 a fat-bottomed lens that makes the rockin' world go round? Fat-bottom girls! Or is it just a flabby-assed optic whose images are softer than the pale skin of my own backside spent plonked on the sofa, eating jammy dodgers and watching Disney Star Wars? Well, today we're going to try and answer that question. Let's try not to be too unkind to the Jupiter 12, but we do have to acknowledge that it has a somewhat sketchy reputation. It's a clone of the Zeiss Biogon 3.5cm f2.8, which is a pre-World War II non-retrofocus wide-angle lens. Now, that retrofocus term just relates to the distance that the rear element of the lens sits away from the film plane. Until the 1950s, wide-angle lenses needed to be close to the film, and it wasn't until Pierre Ingenieux invented the retrofocus lens that you could design wide-angle lenses with enough distance to put a mirror between the film and the lens, giving birth to the single-lens reflex cameras that we all knew and loved. Now, if you know your photographic history, you'll know that in its day the Biogon was considered a great lens. And if you know your geopolitical history, then you'll also know that history is written by the winners. And after the Second World War, the Russians pillaged the design of the Biogon and took them back to Krasnogorsk in the suburbs of Moscow to provide the Soviet proletariat the chance to make Instagrammable moments of their rye bread and cabbage soup. But I digress. The upshot of all of this is that the Jupiter 12 fell from the heavens and into our 21st century laps through the magic of eBay and the former Soviet Postal Service. Though I notice that prices have risen significantly since I got mine, particularly for the L39 Leica thread mount. So that's quite a lot of money for a post-war copy of a pre-war lens, though it's still not as much as the original. But can it take a decent photo? Well, to test it out, I took it to the home of its Biogon progenitor, Germany, specifically Berlin, because I had COVID, so barely left the hotel room. And anyway, nobody invited me to Oberkochen for a personal tour of the Zeiss head office. Despite, or maybe because of that administrative oversight, I slapped on my Jupiter 12 onto my Canon P with a roll of Kodak Gold to wreak Russian revenge against the Fritz of Friedrichstrasse. Now, before you rush out and buy what you think is going to be the bargain Biogon for your Leica 3, you do have to be a bit careful with the screw mount version of this lens because it doesn't fit all Leica thread mount cameras. Apparently, some Canon cameras have baffles inside the lens mount that won't quite accommodate that bulbous rear element, and on others you have to be careful that it doesn't hit the shutter curtain. I have 3 Leica thread mount cameras, the Canon P here. It does fit, as does my Fed 2, which actually fits it quite nicely and makes for a very compact package. My Zorky 4K though, well, it struggles, but that's true with lots of lenses, which seem to twist the rangefinder cam inside the camera, throwing it out of focus. I've tried to fix it with super glue, but these days I tend to just use it with my regular 15mm Jupiter 8 for fear that it'll snap off. Regardless, the Jupiter 12 is a tight fit on any camera, and you can see that I've taken a chip out of the rear element of this one, trying to squeeze its round arse into the skimpy orifice of the Canon P. Now, there's a lot of debate online about whether Soviet lenses fit non-Soviet cameras and vice versa, the argument being that there is a subtle difference in the distance between the mount and the film plane that affects autofocus. But I've got to say, I've never noticed it on the Canon. I've shot 50 and 35mm Soviet lenses and they've focused just fine. So if there's an issue, it's a subtle one that's probably only noticeable on bright fast aperture telephoto lenses that are much less forgiving than wider angle lenses. What is much more of an issue with the lens is its ergonomics. It's not that it's an unattractive lens. In fact, it's got a great compact design. Like an iceberg, all the action is happening underneath the surface. Its front element is small and well protected. It's easy enough to focus and my copy is smooth and well damped. It's really when you try to change the aperture that the problems with the design start to show themselves. The lack of clicks, while potentially good for video, means that you can't adjust on the fly without looking at the serrated ring that doubles as aperture and filter thread, and it's barely readable text. You have to look straight down the barrel and adjust it with your fingernail to change the f-stop, and you're also hindered by the non-linear adjustment where the f-stops just get physically closer to each other, so that by f16 the slightest degree of variation can throw off your exposure by a whole stop. I've never even considered trying to use filters on this thing. But hey, let's take some time to glory in that beautiful rear element. That glass that looks like an oily pool of optical elegance, but no one will ever see because it's hidden at the back. Instead, the public face of this lens is a little glass fingernail that looks like it's from a Pentax point and shoot. Hey, at least it's not ostentatious or gets in the way of the rangefinder, and you still get to personally marvel at the unusual design as you risk scratching it every time you swap out your camera lens. But enough of beauty. If cameras were meant to be beautiful, no one would ever purchase a Sony. Surely the test of a lens is the image it produces. A couple of days later, and feeling a bit more human, I went out and finished off the roll. So what do you think? Please don't forget to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and comment down below. I want to know what you think of this lens. Do you have one yourself? And if so, is it the Leica version or the cheaper Contax RF mount version? From what I understand, they're supposed to be optically similar, but everything you read about Soviet lenses points to really variable quality control, so you can never be sure you've got a good copy. I'm happy with mine, though it does have a couple of quirks. One thing I've noticed is that there were a couple of hotspots on the film. That could have been poor handling on my part or a result of traveling through airport security, but one thing this lens is known for is flaring. Despite its deeply recessed front element, it's known to produce some pretty gnarly pentagonal flares in the right or the wrong light. I also do wonder if there's an inherent flaw in the larger rear element in terms of vignetting. You'll see it does vignette at the extreme corners, particularly wide open. It's like it only just covers the film frame. But there's also this weird inverse vignette, like a circular light band in some of the shots just before you do hit that corner. It's not common, but I'd be curious to read any comments you might have about it. Is it something that you're aware of, or is it just something related to my own copy? I can imagine with this design interior reflections could be a problem. The Jupiter 12 does have a reputation for not being very sharp, but to my eyes it's sharp enough, or at least in the center. You're definitely not getting that crispness as you move out to the edges, particularly wide open, but isn't that part of the lens's character and charm? And it really wasn't noticeable in many of these shots anyway, where there was enough light for the most part to shoot at regular apertures. One thing I have noticed is a slight pin cushioning, which isn't obvious most of the time, though one of the advantages of the non-retrofocus design is supposedly less distortion at the cost of some vignetting. There are also those out there that claim that the low element count of the Jupiter 12 leads to enhanced micro contrast and that 3D pop look. But since I've never really heard a convincing argument about what that actually is, and even if it actually exists, let's not split hairs here. There's actually nothing magic about lens design. It's all optical snake oil using revolutionary technologies to sell us a different mix of compromises. The rear element of the latest version of the lens for the M mount even has anomalous partial dispersion. I kid you not.
That's impossible.
Not if you generate a stable flux between the positron conductors.
So let's just judge the end results on their own merits, and really the biggest challenge with this roll wasn't the lens quality itself, but my own ability to use the Sunny 16 rule effectively. Some of the wonky colors and grain are definitely down to my handling of the mixed lighting, and I think in some cases I expose more for the sky than for the foreground. But let's pick Zeiss Bilder from the Berlin batch, and yes, this is a difficult lens to tame, but there's bread and sausage for everyone, because as lenses go, it may be a bit of a brat, but it's certainly not the worst. Yes, I went there with the Prussian food puns, and look, it's your usual mix of architectural shots and candid environmental portraits. 35mm doesn't encourage you to get in close, so it's less about the people than the place, and it's hard not to include at least one Berlin postcard to complement the gritty underpass and train entrances. Actually, I was in half a mind to include this one too because I like its minimalism. But the image is mostly black, so my full mind balked at the cost of printing and the fact that there's nothing really going on in it. This one was definitely underexposed, but I still included it because it has that contrasty late summer look, and the girl on the bike does go well with the Coke sign in a lifestyle photography kind of way, whatever that means. Unlike that last photo, I'm definitely well overexposed in my own photography, but I still can't pass up the possibility of including one selfie just to remind myself that I was physically there, even if my COVID brain is convinced it was just a dream. Yes, a dream. A dream where I thought I had a Zeiss Biogon on my camera and I was capturing the essence of Germany until I woke up and realized it was just a Jupiter 12. A copy, yes, and a fiddly lens to use when under the influence of cold and flu tablets. But still, if I couldn't quite capture Berlin in its traditional Teutonic majesty, I could at least sprinkle a bit of Smirnoff on the scene and produce a few decent film shots. Later.